Thanks for joining us on our streaming service for your First Alert Avalanche forecast. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri. And joining me now is Brian Lazar from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Brian, welcome.
Hi, how you doing, Callie?
Great. Well, Brian, we are approaching the maximum snow date in early April. How are things looking right now?
Well, as you can imagine, not great. Let me show you where we sit. This is where Colorado sits right now as we approach the end of the week. So we're in that black box there, and you can see the reds are less than 50% of long-term median. Those oranges are anywhere between 50 and 70% of long-term median. So as a state, we're sitting about 60% of long-term median, which is not great. You can see that there's places to our south and our west doing even worse than us, and across the western U.S. there's only a handful of places like along the Tetons that are even close to normal. I was keeping out hope for a good chunk of the season that one or two big storms might get us back to something resembling a normal winter. That is looking increasingly unlikely as we move forward. That black line is the snowfall that's already in the books. This green line is our long-term median, and as you mentioned, that little star up here at the top is our historical peak snowpack date, which usually occurs in the first week of April. We're getting really close to that, and we are nowhere near long-term median. What these dotted lines show is the projections going forward. And so this red line at the bottom would mean if we hit 10% of the daily maximum for every day here on out, that's where we would fall, well below median. The only line that even gets us close to long-term median, and not until even mid-May, would require us to receive 90% every day of maximum snowfall. And so our chances of rebounding to that green line are almost nil at this point, which I'm sorry to report.
Yeah, we've been holding out hope all season, but just not looking likely at this point. As we move towards the weekend, how are conditions shaping up?
Well, it's a little bit of a continuation of what we talked about last week. And so we are on a slow downward trend in terms of avalanche hazard. And you can see we've got a lot more moderate avalanche danger, all of that yellow on the map, which means the likelihood of triggering these avalanches in those areas has gone down. Notably, we have this area from about Vail Pass through Summit County, including Loveland and Berthoud Pass, which still sits at considerable avalanche danger, and that remains our most dangerous part of the state. What is driving the danger for the time being is the persistent slab avalanche problem that has been with us for months at this point. Our most dangerous slopes continue to harbor the cold snow despite the warmer temperatures. So these are higher elevation slopes, generally facing the north half of the compass, but including some easterly facing slopes at the highest elevation. You can see that the likelihood in all of but the considerable avalanche danger has dropped down to possible, but look at the size of these avalanches, large to very large, and this means that the consequences of triggering one of these things has by no means decreased.
Now, over the weekend, we had the first fatality of the season, along with several other close calls. What happened, and what should people keep in mind to stay safe?
Yeah, I'm really, sorry that this happened. This is the first time we've made it into March without an avalanche fatality in Colorado in over 20 years. So people are making some good decisions, but unfortunately we experienced our first avalanche fatality of the season. Here's an image of that fatal avalanche accident site near Vail Pass. That track was both of those tracks were put in by the victim, who was caught in this avalanche, buried and killed on his second lap. This was not the only near miss that took place last weekend. This was the only fatality, but we did have some other close calls. This is the fatal avalanche accident Crown. The avalanches are breaking about 2 feet deep, 2 to 3 feet deep on our February drought layer that we've been discussing here for the last couple of weeks. But here's another really close call from a rider-triggered avalanche near Berthoud Pass. We never talked to the party involved in this avalanche, but you can see they got very, very close to a fairly sizable avalanche, but fortunately no injuries or worse. You can see that the track, likely triggered this avalanche from somewhere just below the crown line here. Here's a natural avalanche that ran, just yesterday near Copper Mountain. You can see this avalanche on the left side of this slope, and on the right side of the slope, you can see this scoured terrain. They picked up about 4 to 7 inches in the northern mountains on Tuesday night. That snow drifted onto these leeward aspects, and just that much drifting snow was enough to produce these fairly sizable avalanches. Here was another close call from several days ago near Quandary, south of Breckenridge near Hoosier Pass. And I want to point out that this terrain feature does not look all that intimidating. That looks like fairly low angle terrain. The start zone is generally just in the low 30-degree range. So not an intimidating slope at all, but the video shows that as this rider comes down the slope, he finds just that wrong spot, a localized thin spot in the snowpack, and he's able to trigger the avalanche from below. And again, remember, we are dealing with persistent slab avalanches. So you can trigger these avalanches from below, and you can trigger them from quite a distance away. Here's an example of an avalanche that was triggered just a couple days ago near Berthoud Pass. This was triggered from hundreds of feet away. The crown broke up to 8 to 10 feet deep at its deepest, ran all the way down to the ground. And fortunately, this person gave this terrain a wide enough buffer to not get caught up in the debris. So we can't emphasize enough that the likelihood of these things is going down, but if you trigger one, they can be triggered from hundreds of feet away, and you can trigger them from below. So we do need to give these steep wind-loaded slopes a fairly wide buffer as we move towards the weekend. Here's one last example of a remotely triggered avalanche on a northeast facing slope right in that bullseye of the most dangerous aspects near Vail Pass, and you can see just how wide these things are breaking. So it really does emphasize that the likelihood might be going down. The consequences of getting caught in this one are not as illustrated by our tragic avalanche accident last weekend.
Now, conditions could change quickly in the second half of the weekend and into next week with record-setting heat possible. What can people expect, Brian?
We can expect a big uptick in wet avalanche activity. So I just picked a random spot in the central mountains that looks at temperatures over the coming days. And so this red line is, daily temperature. It goes up and down because of, day and nighttime swings. This dark line is the freezing, or 32 degrees. And so you can see as we move through Friday and into Saturday, we are going to get temperatures. This is at 11,000 feet that exceed freezing. So it feels like mid to late April out there right now, not mid to late March. We get a brief reprieve as we get a little system that rolls through on Sunday. But then, as you said, next week, those temperatures just continue to climb. We might hit 50 degrees at 11,000 feet. That's going to introduce a lot of meltwater into our snowpack. And so when our snowpack goes through this transition, we start pumping prodigious amounts of meltwater into the snowpack. It can be a really tricky time because we might be wetting those buried weak layers that we've been talking about for weeks. And often the first time those weak layers see water, they wake up and produce avalanches. So we're going to have to be on the lookout for wet avalanche activity. The most problematic slopes are going to be the sunniest and lowest elevation because they're the warmest. And so we're warning about loose wet avalanche activity on near and below tree line slopes on anything facing the south half of the compass, including east and west aspects. Most of these are going to start off as small. We're going to get indications like this, where you see small, loose, wet avalanches. Steep, rocky, sun-drenched slopes like these will be the first to give us warning signs that the snowpack is losing cohesion. If it's no longer supportable to you and you start breaking through the surface freeze, you start seeing avalanche activity like this in this image. Or you see rollerballs and pinwheels, it means it's time to exit avalanche terrain or move to colder, shadier slopes. And by the time we get to next week and we start getting those record-breaking snow temperatures, we're going to have to be on the lookout for wet slab avalanche activity. It's often a tricky period as we go through this spring transition. We're doing it about a month earlier than we would on most years. So really make sure you stay up to date on changing conditions in the forecast, particularly as we start to see those record temperatures early next week.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian. We always appreciate all your advice and insight.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, and we will see you back here next week for your First Alert Avalanche Report.